Yeah, I'm going to, of course, move on today to talk about, of course, the Cold War era. We're going to kind of get into the background of it. I'll kind of talk about the beginning of the Cold War up through the 50s, and I'll kind of go up to like the early 1960s when the Cold War era peaked, especially around the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis. So I'll kind of talk about that today. And then after we come back from spring break, I'll kind of talk about, of course, the rest of the Cold War era and kind of how that goes uh, up to like the fall of the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'll kind of also talk about a little bit maybe a post-Cold War era also as well. So if you have any comments, questions, of course, about this lecture, please let me know during the live stream, or you can always, of course, leave a comment later. You can also subscribe to my channel as well. So anyway, last time I had talked about how, the World War II had ended and, the Allies had defeated the Axis powers. So Germany got defeated, Italy, Japan, and all that. And the only thing about, of course, World War II was that you really only had two major superpowers left after World War II, which was the United States, of course, and the Soviet Union. So that's, of course, something that leads into the Cold War era, which you can see there, which the Cold War era kind of lasts from like right after World War II. It goes up to like close to the early 1990s. And yeah, it was this geopolitical struggle that occurred between the United States and the Soviet Union and their, subsequent allies that were, on both sides that were there. You can see on one side you had the United States that was, democratic, pro-capitalist, and then you had the Soviet Union, which was more pro-communist, undemocratic. And so you get these different alliance systems where the United States is, involved with allies. They call it the Western Bloc later, if you know about that. And then you've got the Eastern Bloc, which was like Soviet Union communists. And you got also a lot of other like Asian countries later, like China, North Korea, Vietnam, that are also communist as well. So all these countries that are out there that are involved in it. And one thing about the Cold War era, why it was so, such a scary period, it wasn't really a real true war, but you almost had World War III break out because, both sides developed nuclear weapons. And if we would have used them, that might have been the end of the world as we know it. Still could be. Still could have World War III, of course, break out, with all these tensions with Soviet Union and, of course, the Ukraine, et cetera. Now, I'm going to talk about the beginning of the Cold War era first, which they think the Cold War era starts really around right after World War II, like usually 1947 is usually when it kind of starts at that point. Of course, they talk about the fact that one of the things that really led to it, you can see, I'll kind of blow this up here, but you got the United Nations. It's considered one of the main things that really led to really, they think, the Cold War beginning. What happened was after World War II, the winning allies like United States, Soviet Union, et cetera, formed this thing called the United Nations, which was an international peace organization and government body that replaced the League of Nations. And it was created originally to, prevent, wars from breaking out like World War II and all that. And they called it United Nations because that was one of the nicknames of the Allied powers in World War II. And it was founded by 5 main countries, by the way, which the 5 main countries that were in it were often called the Big Five. That's usually the nickname they dubbed it. And you can see right there. United States, Britain, France, China, which was originally a Republic of China, and later was the People's Republic of China, Soviet Union or USSR, and then, of course, now Russia, of course, that was in it. And if you know about the UN, they had this thing called the Security Council, which was the principal organ of it. It was charged with, ensuring peace throughout the world and security. Even has its own, UN, military force they use. And it also recommends, what countries can join the UN. And they have like a General Assembly too as well, which they can deliberate and make policies and things like that that represent the whole UN. And If you know much about the Security Council, there's 5 permanent members that are on it, which are the big 5. So those countries are, like I said, U.S., Britain, France, China, and Russia are all the 5 permanent members on it. They are known for having have veto power, where they can veto each other and all that. And of course, like I said, they also have like UN peacekeepers that they have. That's part of the Security Council that enforces a lot of their, resolutions that they issue here and there. The only thing about the UN, they think the United Nations helped to kind of egg on the tensions, in the Cold War, because it got to the point where in the Big Five, they have this veto power and all that on the Security Council. Got to the point where it was United States, Britain, France versus the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China. So that kind of created a lot of tensions, throughout the world. So the UN often intervened in different things like Korea. I know like the Korean War was one thing that kind of was a hot conflict. I think they also talk about the whole, Israel, they helped, create the state of Israel, and all that. And that helped create the Arab-Israeli wars and things like that, of course, later. So you have that kind of, going on at the time. Now, I wanted to get into like the East-West split. That's, of course, one of the major issues that really causes, really the Cold War era itself. One of the big things that happens, in the Cold War era, if you study about it, is the fact that, Germany was occupied after the war. It was divided up and all that. And of course, the other thing that happened too, if you go to that map there on the right, you can see how one thing that happened that was big was the fact that the area of Eastern Europe, Central Europe, became communist, which the Soviet Union, as they defeated Germany in the war, they converted all these countries to basically to communism. So I'll kind of put them on the screen here for you. But basically, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Albania, Romania, Bulgaria, all those countries eventually went communist. Of course, Central Eastern Europe. Also, Yugoslavia did, but they weren't aligned with the Soviet Union. If you know much about that, but they were also communist as well. And so that had a lot to do with why, of course, the whole thing happened. Of course, overall. And then I told you that the other thing was the occupation division. Of basically, the whole Germany was one of the main things, of course, that would occur, that would lead to it. So yeah, that was considered the big thing, the whole, division of Germany. And they didn't just divide Germany, if you know about it, and occupy it with military forces. They also, if you know about it, divided up Berlin as well into different, zones at that point. And kind of talk about some things that happened, of course, with that. About Germany. Germany was divided in these 2 states. You had West Germany, which was the Federal Republic of Germany that was founded in 1949, and it was a pro-Western state, aligned with, like, say, the United States and other countries that was democratic, capitalist, etc. And then the Soviets helped form East Germany, which the real name was the GDR, which is the German Democratic Republic, which had its capital at East Berlin. And you can see the other one, West Germany, was at Bonn. But this state was more communist, undemocratic, of course. And you also had this deal where they even divided up Berlin as well, which was occupied into different occupation zones as well, with West Berlin being mostly American, British, and also the French. And then East Germany was, of course, divided into by the Soviet Union. Of course, much about the Soviets taking over Eastern Europe. Winston Churchill, who by the way had gone out of power in Britain, 1945, wasn't chancellor, wasn't prime minister at the time. He came to America and he coined the term Iron Curtain in a speech in March of 1946 called the Sinews of Peace. It was called, it's kind of a speech and lecture that he gave at a college in Missouri called Westminster College. I think it's in Fulton, Missouri. And Harry S. Truman, who was the president of the United States at the time, of course, was there, of course, at this address. And he described how basically Eastern Europe was being taken over by communism. And he said the famous quote, which you may have heard of, that kind of coined it or whatever. He said that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has ascended across the continent. And so that kind of, they think that's kind of maybe when the so-called Cold War kind of gets started at that point, right after World War II. And he was kind of right about that. The fact that that was kind of going on and nobody knew what was kind of going on, in the East, because the United States had wanted, more democracy and free elections in the East, but that's not what happened. And so you get the beginning of the Cold War, of course, at that point. Now, so you got the Iron Curtain descending. You can see in Eastern Europe, you can see the line kind of going down where it is. Although Yugoslavia was, like I said, communist, but they were more aligned with the West, of course, and all that. Now, one of the things that the United States does at that point is we basically come up with a new policy to try to fight the Soviet aggression with communism. And so you got the so-called Truman Doctrine that began, they think, in 1947. This was a U.S. foreign policy to contain the spread of communism. So we're trying to prevent it from spreading all over the world. Now, I think if you study about it first, the United States tried to go into, if you look there, Greece on the bottom left, Turkey and on the bottom middle, those two areas were having trouble with communist guerrillas that had taken over or trying to take over their countries. And so Truman began to send a lot of foreign aid to those countries, like several $100 million. And that's what began the whole, policy of what became later the so-called Truman Doctrine to try and, stop the spread of communism throughout the world. And the actual containment policy was actually developed by this man named George Kennan, who was an American diplomat that knew a lot about the Soviet Union. He was also an historian. And from 1940s, like from I think up to like the time of FDR, Truman, up through like JFK and Lyndon B. Baines Johnson, you have all these famous foreign policy experts. They were called the so-called wise men. They were dubbed. They kind of helped to forge a lot of the policies that would later, help lead or cause the, Cold War era in the end. So what happened was it later led to this actual economic plan, which they called later the so-called Marshall Plan that came out, which we began in 1948. And it was a aid package that was given to a lot of the Western European countries in the Western Bloc to help them recover from World War II, but also to, I guess, prevent the spread of communism. We spent somewhere between $12–13 billion in helping a lot of countries in Europe, and was named after George C. Marshall, who you see on the right, who was he was actually a famous general in World War II. That was under FDR's administration. It's like one of the top chief of staff under him. But he was also Secretary of State under Harry S. Truman at the beginning of the Cold War, and he later won the Nobel Peace Prize for this idea. George C. Marshall, who you see, of course, there. So that's basically kind of important, of course, with that. Initially, I think we offered the Marshall Plan to like the Eastern Bloc countries, Soviet Union, but they turned it down. I think Stalin didn't trust us and all that, didn't want our money and all that, but it did help to kind of rebuild a lot of the states in Europe, like Britain, France, etc., Italy after the war. Here again, of course, is like I was talking about Germany. Germany, of course, divided up, I told you, into different occupation zones. You can see those are the areas that were occupied. So the area in red would be what we call East Germany later. That, of course, occupied by the Soviet Union. Area in green was occupied by, of course, British forces. Area blue was French forces. And the orange area, of course, you see on the bottom was occupied by the United States. And so that whole area of the green, blue, and orange, all that'll eventually become what they call West Germany. And then you can see in East Germany, you had Berlin in the middle of it was actually occupied too, into occupation zone. So West Berlin was occupied by the British, French, and the Americans, and then East Berlin was occupied by the Soviets. So that caused a lot of conflict later. And it was a big issue. We'll get to it later, but there's a lot of people fleeing to the West through West Berlin, and that's going to later lead to the Berlin Wall being built, which will be built in 1961, starting. And you can see it behind me on the right, behind me. So anyway, I want to talk about also some other things that happened too as well. Now, one of the big events I want to talk about first, of course, in the Cold War era, is the so-called, they had this incident that happened in 1948 to 49, which was the so-called Berlin blockade and the airlift. That was something that really was one of the major issues that really they think started the Cold War. It's one of the first major events of the Cold War era, if you really study about it. And Stalin tried to basically blockade West Berlin because he wanted West Berlin to be communist and not, pro-Western. And so this went on for like a year or so, the blockade. And so Stalin wanted this because of the fact that all these people were escaping. I think they say between like the 1940s up to 1961, somewhere between 3 to 4 million people escaped to the West when the Berlin Wall, wasn't there. And so what the United States did, we eventually did this airlift, if you know about it, started in July of 1948, went to like May 1948, something like 10 months. We began to supply West Berlin with whatever they needed, like food and coal and things like that, fuel, etc. That's a very famous picture of course, of the airlift when you get these planes coming in to help people. And mostly involved the U.S. Air Force and also Britain's Royal Air Force delivered something like 4 million tons of supplies, which I think they say was something like 280,000 flights they did in like 10 months, which they say they could probably fly to the sun and back, the amount of distance that they flew or something like that. And so that was considered one of the major events that really, helped start the Cold War era. You can see the route they took to get to West Berlin. That's Tempelhof Airport in Berlin, I guess West Berlin at the time. And so that's all the planes like unloading. And they say I think I was reading about this, about 2/3 of the stuff that was supplied to them was coal. They keep, I guess, warm, especially in the winter. So what this ends up doing, if it causes the formation of NATO in 1949 because the West doesn't really trust the Soviets and communism, of course, in the East. And so this is like the so-called North Atlantic Treaty Organization that's created, which was this intergovernmental military alliance that was like in Western Europe and North America, which now has 30 countries in it, of course, today that you have. You can see some of them on the map there, included at one point, Britain, France, Spain, Italy, West Germany, now Germany, Austria, Norway, Denmark, Greece, Turkey, United States, Canada. They were all the major countries, of course, eventually in it. Now other countries, of course, are in it now, of course, in Europe that you've got. I think up to like Poland, I think now have kind of joined it. And so that's part of the tensions too that's kind of causing the problems in Europe now between Russia, in the West, because you got all these NATO countries that are creeping more towards Russia. So that's definitely kind of an issue that they have. They did have a NATO military force as well, which Dwight Eisenhower, by the way, we talked about before, was one of their first Supreme Allied commander that they had. Of course, what happened was the Soviets countered with their own alliance, which they call it later the so-called Warsaw Pact, that becomes the so-called Eastern Bloc countries that are in it, that formed in 1955. That included those countries that the Soviet Union was in it: East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Albania, Romania. The only country not in it was Yugoslavia, which I told you was more aligned with the West and all that. It's Stalin and light, but it was basically how you can see how, you can see the Iron Curtain. You can see with all the red countries, of course, on the right. Now, of course, I'll move on. I'll talk about also other things that were kind of issues, of course, in the Cold War era as well. Of course, you get a lot of this fear throughout, the late 40s into the early 50s. And you got like this so-called, they had this thing called the Second Red Scare they had, especially in America and probably in Europe as well, where there was a fear of communism, that communism was going to take over the world, not just in like Europe, United States, but in Asia as well. The United States, they called it McCarthyism, if you know about this. So there was kind of this widespread fear of communists everywhere, people spying on us, within our state or in our government, things like that as well. And they even had like committees you may have heard of called the House of Un-American Activities Committee, which investigated people for having ties with communism or even fascism, I think, as well, which actually started way back in 1938. And it was around until 1975, really up to the 1970s, I guess, was the peak of the Cold War era you had. And so a lot of people had to go before the House of Representatives and be like grilled practically about whether they were a communist or not. And a lot of people would take the Fifth Amendment, if you know about this, and they ended up getting blacklisted. A lot of people, that made, like, I think in Hollywood, they had a lot of actors, if you know about that, directors that were blacklisted, authors were blacklisted. And I think they even Oppenheimer, about J. Robert Oppenheimer, they even took away his security clearances that he had with the nuclear program and all that. And so, because he was supposedly accused of having ties to communists later, things like that. Another thing that was big, that's kind of famous with the Cold War era, they had this famous trial they had in 1940 called the Alger Hiss trial, where they found out that this American official who was in the State Department may have been spying on us for the Soviet Union. They think he may have had communist ties going back to like the 1930s, and he was found innocent of spying, but they kind of accused him of lying, like perjury, they called it. And he was actually at one point he was actually accused of being a communist by a former American communist who was named Whittaker Chambers, who supposedly had some evidence of microfilm that might be connected to Alger Hiss. And it became a sensation, the trial. And they think that's kind of what caused the whole beginning of the, Red Scare in the United States in the late 40s. The Red Menace, I think, was also what they called it as well. There were some that were accused of spying, which they think they may have been. That was the Rosenbergs. You may have heard about them, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. They were accused of spying for the Soviet Union, giving them top secret information, not just on nuclear weapon designs, but I think on information from anything from like radar, sonar, and even some stuff about jet engines and things like that. Because apparently Ethel's brother, David Greenglass, had actually worked at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. And so they think, got information and gave it to the Soviets. They are later accused of being spies and put on trial and found guilty, and they were later executed for it in 1953. So that was something that was kind of famous during the Red Scare as well. Of course, the most famous was Joseph McCarthy. He was from Wisconsin, U.S. Senator. He began investigations into people in the late 1940s about whether they were communists or not in the government. and American society. And that's where the whole, McCarthyism thing came from, in the fact that it was kind of seen as a witch hunt to go after people that were supposedly possibly communists, or even had ties to people that were communists, all that. And a lot of people would kind of not want to, say what happened, or like I said, plead the Fifth Amendment is what they would do, and then that would kind of make you kind of people think you're, guilty, that kind of thing. They do think that he was later disgraced, I think, by 1954. He was also an alcoholic, McCarthy, but there was this thing called the Venona Papers that came out later after the end of the Cold War. The Venona Project was this secretive project where the U.S. and the British began spying on the Soviets and encrypting a lot of their messages. And they actually proved that some of these people were spies. They do think that the Rosenbergs and Albert Hiss may have been spies, they believe. And so maybe I think there's been some speculation that McCarthy was vindicated later or something like that, that proved to be kind of true about it. But it still was seen as kind of like a witch hunt, that kind of thing. And who knows, they might be communists still in the government, that kind of thing. I know that. So who knows? Like the Chinese, probably. So, now there's other things that also scared people a lot. The hydrogen bomb is something else, that scared people a lot. If you know about it, the United States developed the first hydrogen bomb in 1952. USSR followed up too, of course, in 1955, 3 years later, as well. Those are some of the men that helped to develop the hydrogen bomb. Edward Teller was this Hungarian American that came to the United States that worked on the Manhattan Project, and he and Stanislaw Ulam from Europe helped develop it. And then I think Andrei Sakharov on the bottom was the scientist that developed the hydrogen bomb, of course, in the Soviet Union, which the largest hydrogen bomb they ever developed was the Tsar bomb, which was detonated in the Soviet Union in 1961, which was a 50 megaton bomb. That's crazy, that one. And of course, the United States, we tested our first hydrogen bomb in 1952. The hydrogen bomb is more of a fusion weapon, if you know about it. It's called the so-called thermonuclear weapon, kind of like the second generation of nuclear weapons after the initial atomic bombs that were developed, which were way more powerful, compared to what was dropped on, like, say, Hiroshima and all that. We tested the first hydrogen bomb in the Marshall Islands, so-called Operation Ivy Mike, it was called. So that's what made it scary. And then on top of that, you get, of course, both developing rockets to launch them into space. And that's the other issue, of course, that frightens a lot of people, of course, in the Cold War as well. Then the other thing that happened, too, if you know about, of course, the Cold War, was that China went communist. We lost it, if you know about that. That was kind of a big thing, losing China to the communists. And of course, what happened was Mao Zedong, who you see there, who was one of the communist leaders in China, he founded the People's Republic of China in October of 1949 with the capital at Beijing. You can see there. It was announced on the date of October 1st. And if you study about what happened in China after World War II, the Chinese were embroiled in a civil war. After the war, actually, it went back to really before World War II. And in China, you had, the Republican forces going back to, Chiang Kai-shek, who ruled the country. And then you had communists that wanted to take over the country, who were probably backed by the Soviets and all that. And so they had two civil wars. The first Chinese Civil War happened between 1927 to 37, where what happened was those two fought it out, but the Japanese came in and invaded China, and so they kind of put down their arms for a while to fight the Japanese. But when the Japanese withdrew, they went back to war again. And so you had the second Chinese Civil War from 1945 to 49, which the communists called the Chinese Communist Revolution, whatever. And they eventually overthrew, of course, Chiang Kai-shek. And Chiang Kai-shek was forced to flee the country. His forces fled to the island of Taiwan. where they created their own separate country there, the Republic of Taiwan, which is a really small state. It's like an island state which has, like, I think, 24 million people. And of course, the People's Republic of China is like 4.1 billion people. So one of the largest countries in the world. But there was a big conflict, if you know about it, between uh, the UN and China. That for a long time they wouldn't recognize, the People's Republic of China as the official, Chinese state until I think up to like the 1970s. So that was kind of another issue that really caused, of course, conflict as well. One thing about, if you study about Mao Zedong, he was known for committing a lot of atrocities in his country. After he took over, he started this thing called the Great Leap Forward, where they tried to do like the Soviets and, mass industrialization of China, because the fact that China was still like a peasant type, country, which was more agrarian. So they started doing that. And then he also had this cultural revolution as well. Where they tried to uproot traditions in China and make it a purely communist state, like a Marxist-Leninist state. And they think it led to like mass famine because they collectivized everything. China, like it did in the Soviet Union. They think, they're not sure exactly, but maybe as many as 30 to 50 million people may have died, of course, in China in the 1960s and 60s, up to the 60s, I think it was, because of his policies and all that. That's something that is kind of famous about China. But China's later kind of tried to change itself and become more capitalist, which is done in the last so many decades. Now, the other thing, Star Wars Tree doesn't happen until really 1980s. That comes along, of course, under, I'll get to that later, Ronald Reagan, of course, you're talking about, which helped end the Cold War, of course, later. But now I'm going to talk about next the Korean War. The Korean War is one of the major events that really considered one of the first major hot wars that you really have, of course, in the Cold War era. I think that and the Vietnam conflict, those two really, are like your two major hot wars they had, of course, overall. The Korean War itself lasted around 3 years, from 1950 to 53. I'll kind of talk about what helped cause the Korean War. This all goes back to that whole theory about the domino theory you may have heard about, which was a popular theory that started like in the 1950s, that if one area went communist, the whole area would. This is something they started talking about Asia, like East, South Asia and all that. It kind of happens. They happen in Europe, also as well. And the Korean conflict was something that was caused by Japan. Japan had withdrawn from the Korean Peninsula in 1945. And what happened was the Soviet Union and the United States came in, and we created these separate countries that were there. Soviets occupied the northern part of the peninsula. United States occupied the southern part of the peninsula. And so you end up with these separate countries that get formed afterwards. The one in the north is the North Korean state, of course, which was founded by Kim Il-sung. He was the founder of the North Korea, and its capital, of course, at Pyongyang. Kim Il-sung, by the way, is the grandfather, you can see, of the current ruler, Rocket Boy. I think they called him Kim Jong-un. Always shooting rockets up, huh? I guess intercontinental ballistic missiles, or whatever. So you have that state, and they actually call it the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It's actually the official name, but people call it, of course, North Korea. Then you got South Korea, Republic of Korea, founded also in 48, of course. Democratic leaning state. It's capitalist. That was, aligned with the, United States, capital at Seoul. And then its first president was Syngman Rhee, who was kind of like a right-wing dictator, really, but more aligned, like I said, with, the United States. You can see an image, of course, of the Korean War. They, of course, divided at what is the 38th parallel, if you know about that. North Korea above it, South Korea below it, of course, has now a DMZ, which, of course, is there. And the war started in 1950, I think in the summer of 1950. What happened was UN forces, which were probably egged on by, they think, the Soviet Union. I think they think Stalin pretty much egged them on to invade South Korea with the Korean conflict invading. They pushed southward using mostly Soviet military equipment, tanks, and things like that. That's what basically sparked the whole Korean War at that point. And you can see how the North Korean forces actually pushed down to the bottom of South Korea, down to where Pusan is, city in South Korea. And so that forced the United Nations to intervene. It was considered one of the first major events where the UN kind of intervened in the Cold War. And they got General Douglas MacArthur, American general, who was involved in the occupation of Japan at that point, to come over and help South Korea counterattack. And so, if you know what happened, majority of the forces that were used were American forces, really, in the Korean War. I want to say 90% of the forces that fought in South Korea were pretty much American forces. And MacArthur came up with this brilliant plan to attack the western coast of Korea, like the peninsula, and then also attack from Pusan perimeter down on the bottom, and that would force the the North Korean forces to eventually retreat. And so that's what happened. So in September 15th, is when we launched they call it the Battle of Incheon, so they usually dub it. And so using amphibious forces, we landed on the west coast of, I guess, the northern part of South Korea at that point. And so we counterattacked at that point. And so we were able to, drive the North Korean forces, of course, back into North Korea. Some of them got cut off also as well. However, the only thing that was bad was that we eventually took our forces up into North Korea. MacArthur decided to try to, reunify all of Korea into one democratic state. And so what happened was the Chinese decided to intervene to help North Korea out. And so that basically caused the war to eventually become a stalemate. That's what's going to happen, because you'll go back to that map there, right here. Here's kind of a map showing the Korean War. There's another one right here. I'll show you. Let me go back up here that you've got. But I think it's this map a little better. But yeah, we drive them up to like the northern part where the Yalu River is, and then with the Chinese, they drive us back down the peninsula also as well. And the Korean War was a very bloody conflict. Part of it was because of the fact that not just because the Chinese were involved in us fighting against them, but the terrain, the winters were really harsh, kind of mountain terrain they kind of fought in. And the Korean War was a very bloody war. Like 3 million people were probably 1 million deaths overall, mostly civilian deaths, I think, the most that were killed in the war. The United States had something like 54,000 people killed in like a 3-year period. If you really do the math on it, that's a lot of people, killed. And it was a very unpopular war. Like in America, people did not like the Korean War at all. In fact, a lot of people call it the Forgotten War. They want to kind of forget that Korea happened and all that. MacArthur, by the way, a little bit about him. He actually got fired, if you know about this, by President Truman. He was really concerned that MacArthur was going to start World War III because MacArthur, I think, had an idea to use nuclear weapons and maybe drop it on Japan, not Japan, China, like nuke the Chinese, basically to end the war. And so that was not a good idea. And so he brought in this other general, I think named Matthew Ridgway, to take over. But eventually by 1953, they signed an armistice that ended the war. But some say that the Korean War never ended. They have, of course, a demilitarized zone they set up between, North Korea and South Korea, but it's kind of still ongoing. No official treaty, of course, ended, of course, the war. Now, I'm going to move on next. I want to talk about, of course, also something else that happened as well. There, of course, is the so-called truce you can see there that was signed, of course, that ended the war. But President Eisenhower, by the way, elected in 1952, a Republican, of course, to the United States as president of the United States. He helps to kind of end the war, getting an armistice signed, but officially the war never really ended, of course, like I'm saying. Now, one big thing that happened in the Cold War that was interesting was the death of Stalin. Stalin died in March of 1953. He had been ruling for almost like 30 years over the Soviet Union. So that changed a lot of things, of course, in the Soviet Union. It led to a lot what they call later de-Stalinization, which really took off in the 1950s. And you can see here on the right there, you get a new ruler that comes in, who's Nikita Khrushchev. He takes over as one of the main leaders of the Soviet Union. He begins he was actually the leader, if you want to know, from about 1953 to 64, about 10 years that Khrushchev was basically the main power. And he started what they call de-Stalinization, which they actually called it sometimes the Khrushchev fall. So they called it. And it was kind of like Stalin, but Stalin light, I call him sometimes. You get this easing of tensions in the Cold War that happened. They kind of slow repression. They kind of start relaxing things like censorship. They even open the gulags up, let people out of the gulags and things like that. And of course, Khrushchev famously tried to open up to the West, and even I'll get to it later. In 1959, came to the United States to visit us, to try to open things up and all that. He was Khrushchev, who right here in that image, of course, right there, was famous for his so-called secret speech that he gave to the Soviet, like their main assembly, and it's called the "On the Cult of Personality and Its Consequences," which was given, they think, in February of 1956. And of course, one of the things that Khrushchev did, if you know about it, he denounced the policies of Stalin, like the cult of personality and all the hardliner things that they had done before. And so that's what led to a lot of the opening of the gulags and things like that throughout the Soviet Union. So that was something that he helped to do, which helped kind of relax some of the problems in the Cold War at the time overall. However, they do think that Khrushchev's, beginning of de-Stalinization did help to create tensions elsewhere, though, especially in Eastern Europe. And one of the things that happened, if you know about it, they started tearing down statues of Joseph Stalin, and all that. Like you see the head of Stalin right there in the streets, of his head torn off, the statue, etc. Of course, he did warn the West. I mean, he said that, one thing about Khrushchev, he said that he thought the communists in the end would prevail, that communism would rule the world. He said, "We will bury you." That was his famous quote, of course, Khrushchev and all that. And there were different incidents I did want to talk about in the 50s that were kind of famous in the Cold War, kind of go into like the late 50s and all that. They did have the Hungarian Revolution, which broke out in October of 1956. They think this was actually inspired by the Hungarian Revolution because people in Hungary demanded that they ought to get more democratic rights, things like that. They do think it's something that was started by actually university students in Budapest. They, I think, asked for of 16 demands. I think that they wanted. Basically, they got on Hungarian radio and asking for various freedoms and demands, of course. And they actually ran the Soviet forces out. In fact, I think the slogan of, if you study about the whole Hungarian Revolution, was Ruskik Hasa, which means in Hungarian, Russians go home. I guess it's something that the Ukrainians kind of feel too, I guess, today about the Russians. Anyway, they actually formed militias to fight, of course, against the Soviet forces, but the Soviets brought in tanks and all that, and they really didn't have much of a chance, of course. And after about basically 2 weeks, I think it got crushed by the Soviet Red Army, and it caused like over 3,000 deaths. A lot of Hungarians tried to flee the country, of course, later. A lot of them were sent to to whatever prisons in the East. Like, I guess maybe there were some gulags still there at that point. But that was something that they basically, and the Hungarians had, like I said, had wanted aid. In fact, at one point, if you study about it, I think the prime minister of Hungary and I guess Hungarian freedom fighters wanted to get military aid from the West, but fear of World War III, breaking out really prevented that from happening. That's one of the problems with Ukraine, the fact that I guess if we went in there and sent actual Western military forces, you might be looking at nuclear war, World War III, breaking out. They after they crushed it, they arrested Amir Nag, who was the actual prime minister of Hungary. They later had him executed. They killed him for treason, of course, later, I think in 1958. But they basically killed him off and pretty much put communism back in Hungary. They also had this other event that happened in 1956, which almost also caused World War III too, like both of them did, which is the so-called Suez Crisis that happened in October of 1956 as well, about the same time as the Hungarian Revolution is kind of going on. And Egypt had become a republic, if you know this, after World War II, kind of the end of World War II, and really Britain kind of declining, at that point, their empire. And this conflict almost caused World War III too as well. Gamal Nasser, who was the president of Egypt at the time, decided to seize the Suez Canal, which originally was something that had been developed by, I think, France and Britain were the ones that controlled it the most at that point. And he took control of it. And what happened was the countries of Britain, France, and also the state of Israel, which had been founded in 1948, invaded the Sinai Peninsula, took control of it with their military forces in this operation. Happened in October, November of 1956. And they tried to seize control of the canal, take it back, basically at this point. And what happened was the Soviet Union threatened to basically intervene. They declared war on the West, basically. And so they were forced to back down. And so I think Eisenhower in the United States is kind of furious about this because he didn't know this was going to happen. But they do think that the Suez Canal, this crisis or whatever, was really Britain's really last major conflict they were kind of in as a superpower, because their empire is kind of reeling and breaking up, after World War II. And so they backed down, and of course, Egypt, still controls, the Suez Canal and all that today. But they do think that was one of many, conflicts that really were part of the Middle East conflicts. I'll kind of probably talk later about the Arab-Israeli wars, maybe after spring break, but that was another conflict that was kind of, big as well. Then the other thing that happened too, if you know about the Cold War, they had a space race started as well, starting in 1957. What happened was the Soviets launched the first satellite into space, which was Sputnik, or also called Sputnik 1. And that scared the hell out of the United States, hearing this satellite going around the Earth, like beeping or whatever. They also realized that the Soviets could put, they could put nuclear bombs on missiles, right? That kind of thing, shoot nuclear weapons at us. And so that forced the United States to kind of, do the same thing as well. And so, what happened, if you know about it later, of course, very famously here, you can see Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space. He actually, they launched him in space on April 12th, by the way, which was yesterday, the anniversary of it. I think the 61st anniversary, of the first man being put into space right there. And so yeah, that also happened too. Soviets did a lot of things before we did. You know about that in space. That definitely started the space race. Of course, the United States also founded, NASA afterwards, which was founded under the Eisenhower administration in 1958, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and so that started our space program as a rival as well. We later had men in space too. These are the first Americans that went into space. Of course, you can see here Alan Shepard, of course, on the left was really the first American to go into space. And John Glenn, I think, was the first American to orbit the Earth, if you know about it. But I don't know if you know this or not, but we actually, if you know the Russians put up a dog named Laika, like an animal, in the space. We actually put up a chimpanzee first before we put up, human beings. And that was Ham the Astro Chimp. Of course, they called him on the left. I think in that movie, The Right Stuff, they made fun of that and said ham in a can or something like that. We put a chimpanzee into space after Gagarin went up. It's kind of humiliating, but anyway. But yeah, we would, of course, later by 1969 put, of course, a man on the moon, which that'll happen under Nixon. The other big thing I'm going to talk about too that was kind of famous at the beginning at the Cold War in the late 50s. Anyway, you had this deal where Nikita Khrushchev came to the United States in 1959. He visited with Dwight Eisenhower's administration, actually toured the United States. This happened in September 1959. It was a big media circus, if you know about it, but it was an attempt to kind of open up to the West, the thaw, the so-called Khrushchev thaw, of course, we're talking about. And he met like Eisenhower in the White House. You could see Richard Nixon next to Eisenhower, who was the vice president under Eisenhower. I think Khrushchev's getting ready to eat a hot dog or something in that image right there. And there's on the left, Khrushchev, I think his favorite thing was touring a lot of American farms. Khrushchev, if you know about it, was from the Ukraine. He was, I think, the first Ukrainian Soviet leader and all that. And he loved, like, I guess, farms that had corn and pigs and things like that. He also went to Hollywood, which is true right there. There he is with, I think, Shirley MacLaine, her actress on the right. So he got to visit Hollywood. But I think the only thing he was kind of mad about, if you know about it, he demanded that he go to see Mickey Mouse. He and his wife wanted to go see Mickey Mouse at Disneyland, but they refused to let him because they thought it might be a security issue and somebody might shoot him, which that might be World War III, that kind of thing. But basically, yeah, you see starting to open up. Looks like, things are getting better, in the Cold War. But, of course, what happens at the end of the Eisenhower administration, United States, they had this thing called the U-2 incident that happened, of course. That really helped to worsen a lot of tensions between the United States and Soviet Union, which will peak later under John F. Kennedy's administration in the United States. And apparently what happened was they found out that the United States had been using spy planes that were kind of flying over the Soviet Union, so-called U-2 spy plane you may have heard of, which is right here, built by Lockheed. It's really considered one of the first major spy planes that you have. You may have heard of the SR-71 Blackbird. It was kind of famous too during the Cold War as well. But apparently this pilot, he was working with the CIA, Francis Gary Powers, he got shot down over the Soviet Union on May 1st, 1960. It created a escalation between the United States and the Soviets. And so the Soviets didn't trust us at that point. So yeah, that incident that happened, of course. Then, like I said, under John F. Kennedy, I think Lyndon B. Johnson comes later. That's kind of like the peak of the Cold War era, really, in the 1960s. One of the biggest incidents that really was considered a big peak, of course, in the Cold War era was the so-called Berlin crisis that happened in 1961. And the Soviets demanded that the United States withdraw from West Berlin because they believed they had nuclear weapons there in I think in West Berlin or something. They accused them of or something like that. And this culminated in a crisis that eventually would hit. You can see here, like in 1961, it got to the point where American forces were pointing tanks at the Soviet forces in East Berlin. That's actually Checkpoint Charlie, they called it, which is very famous, that goes into the East Berlin side right there. It's not that far from where the Brandenburg Gate is. And so what the Soviets did with the East Germans, they began to build the Berlin Wall. You can see there, which the East Germans began erecting in 1961. And so the construction of this, if you know about the Berlin Wall, it became like a big symbol of the whole Cold War. And West Berlin was actually encircled with it, like a wall around it, which you can see with this map here. And so all the French, British, and American sectors were all encircled because, like I said, West Berlin is in East Germany and all that. You see the Berlin Wall on the right in that picture. And so that became a big thing, the Berlin Wall. When it fell, of course, they think it's the death knell, of course, of what happens later. Of course, you can see an image. That's a famous image, I think. One of the most famous, I think, right there is showing like the different sides. You can see on the to the left-hand side, that's basically East Berlin. And you can see at West Berlin, the other side, it's got all the graffiti on it. You notice that on one side. It's all free, democratic, other side, it's not. It's like you can see perfectly white the way it is. Nothing on there. Of course, you can't cross there because if you do, you get shot. They got dogs that'll basically eat you alive also as well. So a lot of people tried to cross that, that wall, and they got killed. Here's the Berlin Wall also next to it. Goes right where the Brandenburg Gate is. So where the Brandenburg Gate is on the other side, that's East Berlin, and then this side is West Berlin. Here's another picture up showing. You can see the graffiti on one side where West Berlin is, and you can see East Berlin, of course, over there, the Soviet side. Now, also, they had this other thing happen in Cuba. They had the Cuban Revolution break out, which was in the late 1950s. And Fidel Castro, if you know about it, was this Cuban revolutionary that was a Marxist, eventually overthrew the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, who was kind of a dictator himself, but in support of like right-wing and American. Also, the mafia was kind of in with him as well in the United States. And because Batista was such a violent dictator, he had a lot of people killed in this country. It created this revolution that lasted between 1953 to 1959. And it was nicknamed the 26th of July movement, which lasted from 1953 to 1959. Castro would eventually overthrow Batista's government, seize control of the island, which a lot of people didn't know Castro was a communist. He ends up backing, getting backed by the Soviet Union, and turns out to be kind of pro-Marxist Leninist. And he'll take over and rule over Cuba for close to 60 years that he'll be in power. And this created a lot of tensions, of course, in the country. There's, of course, Castro with his brother Raul, who would later take over after Castro got ill and died. Yeah, there's some of the famous men involved. You got Fidel Castro, I think, on the far left. On the right, you kind of see also Raul. And then, of course, Che Guevara. He was one of the famous men involved that was under Castro, who was actually Argentinian Marxist, who helped kind of support a lot of revolutions throughout the world. And he's kind of become an icon later, because of that image right there. I think was kind of what kind of led to it later. But a lot of people don't know about Che Guevara, but he was kind of bloodthirsty. He had a lot of people killed under Castro's regime. And he was infamous for creating these firing squads where they executed anybody that was an anti-Castro Cuban. Most people don't know about that, but He tried to even spread revolution later, like in Bolivia, but he was later captured by forces there and executed in 1967. But he became an icon later, of course. They also got the Bay of Pigs because of the fact that, Cuban-American relations began to deteriorate, afterwards. That led to basically an embargo put on Cuba because it's a communist country. And so the United States supported this thing called the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a CIA operation where they trained a bunch of anti-Castro Cubans in Florida and also later mostly in Guatemala as well. And it happened in April of 1961. It was actually something supposed Eisenhower was supposed to do, but it got put into JFK's lap, and it ended up failing. Most of the anti-Castro Cubans were captured on the beaches of southern Cuba, and the whole thing just blew up. So that was something that was kind of a big thing. And the United States was, attempting to get rid of Castro. They wanted to even assassinate him and all that, but that never, of course, worked out. Of course, the peak event of the whole, Cold War era was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which happened in 1962. That's something I kind of want to talk about. That's very famous. And what happened was they think that this particular event is considered really the peak event, really of really the Cold War, because of the fact that it was really the closest that both sides came to nuclear war. They've had several instances before that and after that kind of may have caused World War III, but they consider this one to be really the worst that happened in the early 60s. And what happened was JFK, by the way, found out, his administration discovered that the Cubans were seeking protection from the Soviet Union. And so what the Soviet side under Khrushchev was to put nuclear weapons, of course, in Cuba to prevent like us invading again, possibly. And so that's basically what caused it. I kind of blow this up right here, but you can see with the nuclear missiles there, obviously the deep south, the United States, was definitely open to nuclear attack, as well as the rest of the parts of the United States, even New York, Washington, D.C. As well. Here's kind of a picture. They actually discovered this through U-2 flights that went over, of course, Cuba, and of course photographed areas where they think missiles were. I think that's a missile shelter tent there where like probably a missile is right there. Those are oxidizer tanks on the right used to launch them. Missile fuel tanks on the left, things like that also. So I've got all these kind of things that are kind of proofs of basically what's going on. And what happened, Kennedy decided to put a blockade. In fact, the Cuban Missile Crisis goes from October 16th to November 20th. It was, I guess, the years of like almost about a month or so this happens. And so Khrushchev orders this blockade of Cuba with the U.S. Navy to try and prevent basically this from occurring and try to force the Soviets to back down and take their nuclear missiles out and all that. And there was we study about what happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was an incident in the UN that's very famous where the U.S. ambassador, which was Adlai Stevenson of the United Nations, on October 25th, 1962, actually presented this information about the nuclear weapons that are, in Cuba. And I'll kind of show you a little video of it real quick here, but it's kind of okay, it will get blown out of there. But anyway, you can see that Khrushchev, backed down. That's one of the things that happened. Of course, that's famous, about the fact that kind of go this image right here. But a lot of people didn't want a war, breaking out, at that point. And so Khrushchev kind of blinked, they say. And so he eventually removed his missiles from Cuba. And then what also happened, I think we had missiles in Turkey, I think it was. We removed missiles there as well. And so both sides, avoided World War III at that point. So that was really the closest that we really got to, World War III. We have other ones, I think, later that happened. I think I want to say in the 1980s, there was an issue too that happened that almost caused World War III. But that's really the closest overall. So anyway, that's it. Lecture part one, of course, on the Cold War. Later, of course, after spring break, I'll kind of, continue talking about the Cold War era. I'll also talk about later, I'll get to it, but I'll get into the Vietnam conflict. That's something else that was kind of a major conflict, of course, in the war. I'll probably talk about the Middle Eastern conflict. That's kind of an interesting topic too, going into like talking about the Arab-Israeli wars and all that. That's kind of famous a little bit. I'll kind of maybe mention that. Also, Middle Eastern, like you've got the Iranian Revolution. That's another Middle Eastern thing as well. We'll talk about détente. Détente was a big thing in the 70s, where there was an easing of tensions between the U.S. and Soviet Union, especially by the time of Leonid Brezhnev, who was the ruler of the Soviet Union. And then I'll get to the end of the Cold War with under Ronald Reagan's administration, probably talk about Star Wars and all that stuff as well. So that's it for today. Don't forget, I said I had a bunch of assignments out there, but remember, second exam, of course, that's due tonight. Also, War I quiz is still out. I think that's due Friday, I believe. Third vocab due also Friday, and then book reports, I think, are due by, I want to say Monday at the latest overall. But that's it for today. Y'all take care. Y'all have a great spring break, by the way. But after we come back, of course, I think it's the 25th. I'll have another lecture later, part 2 on the Cold War. This era will be these lectures will probably be for more like a quiz later. So y'all take care, and y'all have a great, of course, spring break overall. Y'all take care.